Hey guys, this is Craig Migliaccio with AC Service Tech, and today what we're going over are the top 5 reasons why your vacuum gauge micron level may be jumping around. So say you have your vacuum setup attached to an air conditioning system or a refrigeration unit, and you're pulling your vacuum down and you get down to a level of say 700 microns, and then all of a sudden the vacuum goes back up to say 820, and then it drops down to say 530, and then it keeps coming back and forth, up and down and up and down. So if it doesn't just continually go straight down, there could be several reasons for that happening, and I'm going to be going over each of those reasons in this video. Make sure to check out our refrigerant charging and service procedures for air conditioning paperback and ebook available over at our website at acservicetech.com. This book goes over all the step-by-step procedures to get a system ready for refrigerant, checking the refrigerant charge, and also troubleshooting. The full outline is available over at acservicetech.com. One of the biggest reasons that a vacuum gauge micron level will be jumping around is if you have water in the system. So if that line set was ran and the ends were not crimped off tight and you weren't necessarily installing this whole system all at one time, you could have had some water enter into the system, or if you left the ports to the service valves open while installing the system, you could have some water vapor in the inside. And if you have some puddling of the water and you're pulling a vacuum, what's happening is you're having these small pockets of water are evaporating and they're getting pulled out of the system, and therefore the pressure is increasing. Now eventually that micron level will settle out and it will drop down and continue to come down, and that's when you have all that water is out of that system. But if you are not experiencing that and the micron level just continues to jump around, you're going to have another issue. The second reason that you could have the micron level jumping around is if you have oil, say in the evaporator coil, and you're pulling a vacuum from both sides of the system. If you had a glob of oil in that indoor evaporator coil, and what's happening with that vacuum is that glob is moving from side to side and it's kind of closing off that pipe, that could be the issue right there. So if you're working on an existing system and you've recovered the refrigerant out of it and you're fixing a component and you pressure tested and now you're vacuuming, and now you're noticing an issue, you got to realize that there's still oil throughout that entire system. So a lot of oil tends to get trapped in that evaporator coil depending on where that coil is located at. In that situation, you should do an oil blowout procedure, which is basically you're flowing 100 psi of nitrogen from one side, and that would be in the liquid line. So you're putting it into the liquid line port and it's coming out of the vapor line port. You're not necessarily blowing any oil out of the system, but you are blowing the oil onto the inner walls of the tubing, so you're allowing the vacuum to be pulled through all the tubing. You'll still put a cup there at the vapor line port just to catch if there's a droplet of oil that comes out or something like that, but there really shouldn't be any oil that flows out of that system. You're just blowing it onto the inner walls of the tubing. Right after you get done that procedure, you should do the vacuum procedure so that you can make sure that you can pull that vacuum through all the tubing properly. A third reason could be that you have a dirty vacuum gauge, which means that maybe you had the vacuum gauge attached to the setup and you broke the vacuum with refrigerant either from the system or from the bottle, and that forced oil up into the vacuum gauge sensor. So the vacuum gauge manufacturer will prescribe a method to clean that vacuum gauge sensor. A lot of times it's rubbing alcohol on that sensor, but you really need to make sure to read up on the cleaning procedure for that particular vacuum gauge. But that's why I use 3 valve core removal tools. So in this picture here, you see that you have a third valve core removal tool. Before I break the vacuum with refrigerant from the system or from a bottle, I close off the valve connecting that vacuum gauge. I rarely have to ever clean that vacuum gauge. It really doesn't get dirty with that oil. So anybody that's had that problem happen with oil getting into that vacuum gauge, you know that it's a very frustrating scenario. So I highly recommend that you use a third valve core removal tool in order to valve off your vacuum gauge. Also remember that you want that vacuum gauge as close as possible to that system so that you can measure that system accurately. You also want to make sure that you can do a standing vacuum test, which means you can isolate the vacuum pump and hoses from the vacuum gauge and the system. So that vacuum gauge is going to read that true vacuum inside the system while that vacuum pump is off. Another problem that you could have is if you have a intermittent leak in your hoses or at the service valve. So if that service valve, say, is an older service valve, it's going to have some O-rings on the inside that may be dry. So say you've replaced a component such as the compressor and you've pressure tested the system and the pressure test showed that there was no leaks, but now you're vacuuming this system with the service valves in the open position, and now it seems like it's not pulling down to the required vacuum level below 500 microns. What could be happening is that O-ring could be dry, so what you could use is you could shut your vacuum off and break your vacuum with nitrogen to raise your pressure back up to 0 psi-G. Then after that, what you could do is, with this whole system off, since it's empty anyway, you can front seat the two service valves, and then you take a Q-tip with some Nylog, and you can put that Nylog right on that Q-tip and rub it onto the inner walls of that service valve. Then what you do is you can backseat those service valves, and that will wet that O-ring. And you could go up and down with that service valve, but basically once that O-ring is moisturized with that Nylog, and Nylog is a lubricant that is good for all refrigeration systems, it's not going to contaminate the system, but once you do that, it should seal up to make a good vacuum unless that O-ring is completely worn out. But that's a good trick in order to seal up that service valve in order to pull a vacuum through that system. You always want to make sure to check the rubber grommets on the end of the hose and make sure that they're in good condition, and then replace them if needed. That will typically take care of the sealing problem of your hoses attaching to the ports. The fifth reason could be if you did a pump down on the outdoor unit and the outdoor unit is holding the refrigerant inside, but you've basically locked off that refrigerant from the line set and evaporator coil. Now your line set and evap coil are at 0 psi-G, but you're not able to pull a vacuum through those lines, or some type of problem. It could be that those service valves are not front seated enough. So you could have some refrigerant from the outdoor unit leaking across that service valve and entering into that tube that you're trying to vacuum. So you want to make sure that with a ratcheting service wrench that you go ahead and tighten that service valve stem clockwise all the way down, and you can use an adjustable wrench to hold that service valve in order to make sure that you don't accidentally crack any braze joints on the tubing. So that's an easy and quick thing to check while you're doing your vacuums, just to make sure that you have that front seated down all the way. So remember that we have all these procedures, all the vacuum procedures, all the pressure testing, and the total weight method for breaking the vacuum with refrigerant from the bottle. All these different methods, checking the refrigerant charge while it's running, and troubleshooting airflow problems. We have all those scenarios step by step laid out in our book, The Refrigerant Charging and Service Procedures for Air Conditioning. You can check out the full outline over at acservicetech.com and also purchase the paperback and/or ebook there. We have the paperback available over at amazon.com/shop/acservicetech. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and also hit the bell notifications so that you get notifications when we put new videos out. Make sure to also sign up to our updates list over at our website so you can get the updates for the new articles and videos that we post. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and we'll see you next time at AC Service Tech channel.